great to be back for this evening. You can see our topic. We're looking at evidence of creation. We're looking at evidence of design. In fact, we've kind of tentatively named this presentation Flowers, Fungus and Fossil Fanatics. You see down here we have a book called Tights, Mites and Fossil Fights. I came up with that name, and it's all about how the evidence that the world is young based on geology. And I've been campaigning for a few years now, and it looks like we're finally going to be pushing forward with it. I would like a second one in that series of Flowers, Fungus and Fossil Fanatics talking about design. So let's delve into it. Question, what is hydrogen? Well, some of you with a more sort of sciencey background might be able to give some lovely technical definitions of hydrogen. It's a very simple element. It's a very abundant element. If you know anything about the history of air ballooning, it's a very explosive element as well. But you see, if you believe in evolution and millions of years, then hydrogen is something far more remarkable than just that. You see, hydrogen, given enough time, can all by itself evolve into every physical and non-physical thing, living and non-living thing that is in the universe. Given enough time, hydrogen, a colourless, odourless gas, turns into you and me. I mean, this is really what the theory of evolution teaches, that hydrogen all by itself can turn into everything that we see around us, whether it be a chair or whether it be a human being. You see, this is what was quoted to us in a debate that our dear John Mackay had against Dr. Chris Carlos from Harvard University a few years back. He came up on the stage and Dr. Chris Carlos, an atheist, said a creation is something that cannot happen by itself. Now, I don't quite know why he said that, because that's actually something we completely agree with. It gave us a good starting point for defining the difference between what a creation is and what an evolution is. So what is an evolution? Well, if a creation is something that can happen or cannot happen by itself, then an evolution is something that can happen by itself. Only natural processes are involved in evolution, and no outside intelligence is required at all. Whereas a creation, therefore, must be anything that cannot happen by itself. And here comes the technical definition. The end result has properties that do not come from the original materials. Now that's a big string of words. We're going to break it down as we go forward, don't worry. But you see, the real key thing is that outside intelligence is always required when it comes to a creation. Doesn't matter how simple the creation is or how complex it is, outside intelligence, intelligence that does not come from within the machine, come from within the object, come from within the creation, outside intelligence is always required. Yes, that does include AI. I wonder what the implications of that are. But you see, a creation will always prove someone who was not part of it, someone who was greater than it, actually made the things do what they do not do by themselves. So let's dig into this question of design. Let's dig into this question of evolution, creation. What evidence is there out there for one or the other? Well, here's a book on the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilised by insects and on the good effects of intercrossing. Hey, they don't write titles like this anymore, do they? Who's it by? Well, I'm sure you've heard of the author if you've never heard of the book. It's by a certain Mr. Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin, believe it or not, was an excellent scientist. He actually took some remarkable observations, and he came to some very good conclusions, particularly about orchids, as well as about earthworms. The problem is most of us remember him for a different book. Most of us remember him for On the Origin of Species. Oh, by the way, that's not the title. The full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. Yes, they liked big, long, complicated titles back then. But you see, even though he was a very good scientist when it came to making observations about orchids and earthworms, it was in The Origin of Species where, really for the first time, because it wasn't the first book that he wrote, he started to make some large leaps that went simply beyond his observations. I mean, he observed change when he was travelling around, and his argument was very simple. If you can see a small amount of change happening in a small amount of time, surely a large amount of a change could happen given enough time. Not based on evidence, not based on observations, but based on an assumption. An assumption, by the way, that came from a place that was anti-God. We know this because Darwin himself said, "I soon came to realize that the Holy Scriptures were no more to be trusted than the sacred writings of the Hindus." Yeah, not good a place to start. You do have to ask the question, though, what did Charles Darwin graduate in? And you'll see this is the problem with the idea that academia gives you credibility. Because you see, Darwin graduated with a Master of Arts in Theology. In other words, Charles Darwin was far more qualified to stand up here and preach than I am. That is, if you go by academic standards. But then vice versa, I'm far more qualified to speak on evolution than Darwin ever was. And the evolutionists don't like you reminding them of that. But you see, Darwin graduated in theology in the days where if you wanted a theology degree, you actually had to read the Bible, and he would have read this. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. Everything that God made was very good. And you see, Darwin looked at the world around him and he came to the conclusion that the world around him was not very good. And so he had a challenge. Bible says everything was very good. Everything today is not very good. Therefore, there's a contradiction and we can get rid of the Bible. It's a shame he didn't carry on reading to chapter 3 of Genesis, where it tells you just why everything went from good to bad to worse. But you see, I wonder if we can see, even in this fallen world, even in this sin-filled world, I wonder if we can see any evidence of the remains of this very good world. Well, a great place to start would be the flowers. I love flowers. These are those beautiful orchids, the same kind of orchids that Charles Darwin studied. And of course, in Genesis chapter 1, it says, God said, let the earth sprout plants according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And by the time you get down to Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, it says that God looked at all that he had made, and it was very good. Now, of course, we live in a world that is no longer very good, but sometimes if you're out and you've got a beautiful bouquet of flowers, or you see the beauty and design, you do get a little taste of what that very good world may have once been. You also get a taste of just how well everything was designed to actually work together. Case in point, here's a beautiful flower. Some of you might recognize this flower. It's actually a water lily. And water lilies are some of the most beautiful flowers out there. Well, ask yourself this question. How long can you take to make a water lily? Or rather, what would you need in order to make sure that this water lily was able to survive? Well, one of the key things about water lilies is they live in water. They live in the middle of the water. And you see, in order to make new water lilies, the flowers actually have to be fertilized in order to produce fertile seeds so that they can actually grow elsewhere in the pond. And of course, and you know all of this, in order to fertilize flowers, you need bees. And these are some beautiful flowers that are in Australia, these water lilies, and you might just be able to spot the little tiny Australian bee. Cute little thing. I mean, he doesn't even really sting you. But you see, what the bee does is the bee flies down, and as he's sucking up the nectar, he covers himself in pollen. And that gives him the ability to fly out to the next flower and pollinate it. Wonderful piece of working together with the flower, hey? Of course, you do have a small problem. You see, these water lilies are in the middle of the pond. And water absorbs heat. It absorbs heat really well. And this is a little teeny tiny bee. And so you see, as the bee begins to fly from one flower to the next, as he flies over, the water is sucking all of the energy out of him. It's sucking all of the heat out of him. Soon, without heat, the bee will no longer be able to fly or survive. And after just a visit to one or two flowers, that bee will get over the water and drop down and drown. And that's, of course, is why all bees have gone extinct. No, they haven't, and neither have water lilies. So something else must be going on here. How do these water lilies actually survive? And how do these water lilies actually get themselves to be pollinated? Well, there's your water lily. Can you see that sort of red-hot looking glowing centre? Well, that's not actually that far from the truth. Look at this little experiment, and if you have water lilies, you can do this as well. You see, on this lovely Australian day, the air temperature outside was 26.2 degrees centigrade. That's 79.2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a pretty nice and pleasant day. But you see, the water temperature was only 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Much, much cooler. But you see, the flower temperature inside was 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Hey, that's quite a bit warmer than it was outside. You see, the flowers are actually able to produce a heat source so that as the little bee comes down and lands in, he spit like a recharge of energy. Great big, not just from the nectar that he's sucking, but actually from the heat that the flower is producing, warms him up, he's able to cope with the trip across the pond. Wow, great stuff. You do realise that without this heat, that bee wouldn't be able to survive, and neither would the flower, because both would go extinct if this wasn't the case. And in fact, the people from Cambridge University who actually did this research and first of all worked this out, they had to say this: the implication that we're really most excited about is that flowers are cleverer than we thought they were. Okay, are we really dealing with clever flowers? No, we're dealing with silly scientists who have made a wonderful piece of, made an observation about a wonderful piece of design, but they've forgotten this. It's not clever flowers we're dealing with, it's a clever creator. For since the creation of the world, says Romans chapter 1 verse 20, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Christ's attributes are literally stamped into the creation that he's made, so there is no excuse but to believe that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. You see, when it comes to the living world, cooperation is the norm. Nothing in the living world works in isolation. God made fully functioning ecosystems. And even though we live in a world of sin today, in a world where ecosystems are breaking down, in a world where many ecosystems today include things like hunting and killing and dying and worms decomposing animal carcasses and all that nasty stuff, the reality is the same system of ecosystem in the beginning was very good. And you can see the remnants of that today, even in the bees and the flowers. Amazing stuff. Wow. All right, let's have another look at a piece of design. What has the fastest acceleration of all time? Oh, I'm not talking about speed, I'm talking about acceleration. That is going from a standstill to a certain speed in the shortest amount of time. What has the fastest acceleration of all time? Well, some of you might think it might be a speeding bullet. Maybe it's one of those fancy supersonic jets. No, well, the answer of what has the fastest acceleration of all time that we know of is actually in this picture. No, it's not the horse, it's actually what's come out of the backside of the horse. Oh, you didn't think we were going to be dealing with stuff like this on a Sunday evening, did you? But you see, you have to get up close and personal with this kind of poop because there's something that grows on it. A little fungus. In fact, it grows exclusively on horse manure. It's common all throughout the United Kingdom and the United States. It's called a pilobolus fungus. Now, I've always been fascinated with mushrooms and fungus ever since I was a young boy, and I was involved as doing surveys on funguses. I was the official recorder for the county of Norfolk on fungus. There's a title for you. But it was great fun actually getting up close and personal because fungus are so remarkable when it comes to evidence of design. And pilobolus funguses are no different. You see, they really do come en masse when you find them. And if you bend down, if you can cope with getting that close to horse manure and put your ear up close to it, you can hear the fungus even speaking to you. Little pop, 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 pops. What's going on here? Well, there's a close-up of the fungus. You've got a pressurized capsule at the top. You've got a stalk that goes down into the manure. And then you see the black bobble on top. Well, you see, this little black bobble on the top here is actually the spore. Think of the spore as the seed of the fungus. It's a little bit different, but it's essentially the same thing. And you see, this little spore is there. It's actually designed, the fungus is designed to orient itself heading towards the light. And that little bubble there actually works as a lens. And as the light comes down and passes into it, well, what happens to liquid when you begin to heat it up? It begins to expand and get bigger, and so does the bubble, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I wonder what's going to happen. But you see, as the fungus carries on, the fungus has a little bit of a problem. Because you see, that little spore, the little seed bit there, it actually needs to pass through the digestive system of a horse in order to kickstart the growth. So it goes through the horse, gets partially digested, gets delivered at the other end of the horse with a lovely pile of fertilizer ready for it to grow. Of course, no horse in their right mind is going to go and eat the grass from anywhere near round its own plop. So you see, the fungus has to get that little spore onto a fresh blade of grass, which the horse is able to eat. How does it do that? Well, this is some footage from Miami University a few years back. It's been slowed down many times, but just have a look at this and see if you can spot what's going on. There's the little fungus. Oh, look at that. It goes boom. It's almost like a little cannon. It fires that little spore into the air with an enormous amount of pressure. And in fact, this is the fastest known acceleration that we have ever found. Now, acceleration and speed and all that is all slightly different from each other. So let's actually get into exactly what's going on here with the acceleration of this spore. Right, you all understand that? It's probably a bit beyond us tonight, hey? But let's try and take that as best as we can and try and put it into terms that we might be able to understand. You see, this spore with the pilobolus fungus, and there are many other types of funguses that do this. They're all known as the spore shooters, the Ascomycetes. You see, this spore has an acceleration of 0 to 45 miles per hour in 2 microseconds. Now that's pretty speedy. The little spore will be exposed to over 20,000 times the G-force. And some of these spores get to a top speed of 186 miles per hour. Now that's pretty speedy. This, by the way, is the equivalent to, if you wanted to experience that amount of G-force, a human being launched at 100 times the speed of sound. Or you being launched, that is, at 756,777 miles per hour. Now, that's pretty speedy. But you see, there's one more thing about this little spore. You see, here's the spore. It gets launched off and it flies over. Some of these can travel a couple of meters, which is amazing for a tiny little millimeter tall fungus. It flies over, it hits a blade of grass. There's a big droplet of dew on the grass, and so it simply hits the droplet of dew, falls off onto the floor, and then the fungus goes extinct. Now, it doesn't do that because can you see that sort of shiny surface thing there? You see, these little spores are actually covered in calcium oxalate crystals, which are what are known as hydrophobic, literally water-hating. And so if it does hit any water that's sitting on the blade of grass, it simply rolls off and sticks to the grass underneath. And therefore, it's able to actually go on and survive. Now, as amazing as all this is, you do have to ask yourself the question, how did all of this evolve from nothing, without intelligence, all at the same time? Because you see, if you had the spore there, but it didn't have the ability to blast it, or get itself blasted off of the fungus, then it would go extinct. If it could blast itself off of the fungus, but it didn't have the ability to survive that amount of G-force, then it would simply disintegrate. If it could survive the G-force, but it didn't have the calcium oxalate crystals, it would fall to the ground and go extinct. You see, all of this has to be in place at the same time in order to get a functioning fungus. You remember what an evolution is? An evolution is anything that can happen by itself. Only natural processes are involved. There is no outside intelligence required. Whereas when it comes to a creation is anything that cannot happen by itself. The end results have properties that do not come from the original materials, and outside intelligence is always required. Remember that a creation will always prove someone who was not part of it, someone who was greater than it, made it do what it doesn't do by itself. Well, let's look at one more piece of evidence of design before we begin to round it up and really get down to the depths of these definitions. Meet Mr. Richard Dawkins. Happy-looking chap, isn't he? He could do with some of the joy of Christ in his life, I think. But you see, this was actually a photograph taken while our director, John Mackay, was actually debating Richard Dawkins. By the way, Richard Dawkins had hidden that recording for many, many years until we managed to uncover it. It's now up on our YouTube channel. I would highly recommend that you go and watch it. It's a fascinating discussion between two men of really, you could say, polar opposite extremes. And in fact, it shows you just how easy it takes to defeat an atheist, because within 10 minutes of discussion with John Mackay, Richard Dawkins had no arguments left except to attack John Mackay's personal finances. Now that tells you that he's lost the argument pretty badly. But you see, here's another argument that Richard Dawkins has made. In his book called The Greatest Show on Earth, he makes a rather interesting claim. His claim is that mankind's eyes are so badly designed they must have evolved by random processes. Now, it was actually Charles Darwin that said, when you consider my theory and you look at the eye, it really does seem absurd that an eye could evolve. Yet Richard Dawkins is saying it's so abundantly clear that the eye must have evolved because it is so badly designed. Specifically, this is his quote. The claim is that our retina is on back to front. Here's what he says. The eye's photocells are pointing backwards, away from the scene being looked at. The wires connecting the photocells to the brain run all over the surface of the retina, so the light has to pass through a carpet of masked wires before they hit the photocells. Now, most of you probably fell asleep at the word photocells, so let's actually try and see what we're dealing with. Here is your classic high school textbook diagram of an eye. You see the lens over on the left-hand side. You see the sort of yellow receptor cells at the back of the eye. And can you see that big red mass in the middle labeled the retina? Now, you see, Richard Dawkins is viewing the eye as a sort of old-fashioned camera, you know, with a lens at the front and a space in the middle and a piece of photo paper at the back. And when you aim the camera and you go click, the lens cap opens, the light passes through the lens, travels through the empty space and hits the photo paper on the back, and you get a picture. Now, if you took your hand and you inserted it in between the lens and the photo paper, what would happen? Not a lot, right? You wouldn't get a picture. That would be, you could almost say, an idiotic thing to do if you were trying to take a picture. And you see, Richard Dawkins's claim is that the light that has to pass through this big mass of blood cells is a silly way of designing your eye. Well, here's a slightly more complicated diagram of what the retina looks like. You can see the blue sort of photoreceptors at the back. Can you see the sort of red spidery looking things? Those are blood cells. And Richard Dawkins says, look, the light has to travel this way through the eye to reach the photocells, and it has to pass through this big old messy mass of blood cells in order to reach the photoreceptors. He is missing one vital thing, though, and that is the yellow spidery-looking things. They are called Mueller cells. Now, bear that in mind, because we'll come back to the Mueller cells in a moment, but just going on to what Richard Dawkins says, you see, this is his quote, talking about the eye. He says that if he had it his way, he would send the eye back to its designer, because he says it's not just a bad design, it's the design of a complete idiot. Now, I wouldn't like to be in Richard Dawkins' shoes when he meets the one who actually designed the eye. But let's ask ourselves this question. What is going on with this idea of an inverted retina? Inverted retina sounds nice and scientific, doesn't it? It's like a doctor pronouncing a problem. Well, yes, we've checked you out and you've got an inverted retina. Well, Dawkins is not the first one to make this claim. He almost certainly won't be the last. What's interesting is that this arrangement of the photoreceptors being behind the retina is found in all vertebrate eyes. Every single creature and animal with a backbone has this arrangement when it comes to their eyes. I wonder if that has something to do with how it's actually designed. Well, there's your eye, and what's going on here? Well, you see the lens on the left-hand side? Well, the light passes through the lens to get to the back of the photoreceptors. Now, answer this question. If you go outside on a lovely sunny day and you produce or get yourself a kind of a lens, whether it's a magnifying glass, or even if you get, the hose pipe and you turn the hose pipe on and you go, what gets shone out on the ground underneath? A rainbow. Why? Because you see, when light passes through a lens, and of course it was Isaac Newton who famously did this with his prism, right? As light passes through a lens, the light begins to separate. You've got the red end of the light and the blue end of the spectrum, and as it passes through a lens, that begins to separate. And in fact, your eye lens does exactly the same thing. So you see, by the time that the light actually reaches your photoreceptors at the back of the eye, can you see what's happened? The red light and the blue light is split apart, and you would never see in focus. In fact, you would go around all the time with a sort of a psychedelic haze around everything you're looking at. Now, I know that some people might take drugs in order to look like that, but it's a genuine medical condition that some people have. You see, the red light and the blue light would split apart, and you would not have a good functioning eye. That is, if the eye functioned the way that Richard Dawkins thinks it functions. You remember those Mueller cells? Those yellow spidery looking things? Well, what those are for, rather interestingly, is they pass through the retina. And as the light travels through your eye lens, it actually gets directed into these Mueller cells. Now, these Mueller cells just so happen to be exactly the right length and exactly the right thickness so that the light will be bounced up and down and left and right and up and down and all over the place until by the time that it hits the photoreceptor cells and the rods and the cones at the back of the eye, the red light and the blue light are delivered into the same cone cell. In other words, the red and the blue spectrum have come back together again, and you can see in clear focus. Now you see, the researchers who discovered this had this to say. The retina is revealed as an optimal structure designed for improving the sharpness of images. Wow. In fact, you can go one step further, because if Richard Dawkins really had designed the eye and he'd put the photoreceptors the other side of the blood cells, you do realize that you would be blind within about 30 minutes. Because you see, the light that passes into our eye is pretty harsh. And it turns out that the part of the eye that receives needs to be replaced constantly by supplies that are sent through our blood cells. In other words, you actually need those little blood vessels there to be able to deliver vital assistance to the eye, otherwise your eye would literally be burnt out. If you designed it any other way, you wouldn't have a functioning eye. And so you see, you can really take your pick here, because Dawkins says it's not just a bad design, it's the design of a complete idiot. Whereas the researchers say that it's an optimal structure designed for improving the sharpness of images. Question, now who's the real idiot here? Well, I don't say that to try and mock Dawkins particularly, but the idea of the inverted retina is evidence of our ignorance, not of our origin. Some good general principles for anything that we don't understand. These discoveries were made in spite of evolutionary theory, not because of it. Creation is a far better basis for science, and we can actually come and start from the point of view of everything has a purpose, so let's investigate it until we find out what it is. That's why people were chopping out tonsils and appendixes for so many years, because we didn't know what they were for, therefore we assumed they were useless. No, they all have a reason, they all have a purpose, and the purpose is good. By the way, you can go one step further with eyes, and perhaps this will really start to close in on exactly what we mean when we say that a design is something that has properties that do not come from the materials it's made of. Now, that's quite a complicated statement, but we can begin to break it down. Introducing a trilobite. Trilobites are these little bug-like creatures. We actually have some of them down here. Come and see them afterwards. As far as we know, they're now extinct, but they lived on the bottom of the ocean. And interestingly enough, these little creatures are often found rolled up in a ball. In fact, they're in the same family as, they're in the same family as what you call roly-poly bugs over here, or pill bugs. We call them woodlice in the UK. I mean, what happens to a woodlouse or a pill bug if you poke and prod it? It rolls up into a ball. Why? Because it's frightened. Interesting then that many of the trilobites we find in the fossil record are rolled up in a ball, indicating that they were alive and scared when they were actually buried. Hey, I wonder if a flood would do that sort of thing. Well, you see, these trilobites are so well preserved, we can actually see their eyes. They have a compound eye made up of lots and lots of lenses, one on each side of the body. And yes, with some clever photography, you can get right up close and actually see some brilliant lenses there, brilliantly preserved lenses. Stick it under an electron microscope and the detail becomes even more apparent. Take a very, very thin knife and slice down through the eye and put it under a scanning electron microscope, and this is what it looks like. This is a single trilobite compound eye. What are we looking at? Well, there's the front lens, there's the back lens, you have a little piece of oriented calcite that runs through it, you have this back bowl here, and there's something really important about this oriented calcite in here. Why? Well, it turns out that there's actually something which functions as a correcting lens. You see, if you didn't have this oriented piece of calcite, then the trilobite's eye would work like this. There is the eye, there's the calcite, no oriented calcite on the back, no bowl that's running along the back, and so you see as the light comes into the trilobite's eye, it passes through the eye, and look what happens on the focal plane. Can you see that sort of rocket-looking thing on the right-hand side? You see the focus point of each part of the trilobite's eye is going to hit at a different place on the focal plane. In other words, the trilobite would never be able to see very well at all. If, however, you put this little wiggly piece of calcite in the back there, all of a sudden this correcting lens makes an enormous difference. Can you see how all the light hits the same point at the focal plane? All of a sudden, the trilobite can see clearly. There it is, with and without. A mess on the top, nice and easy to see on the bottom. And it's because of this piece of calcite that runs through the trilobite's eye that the trilobite is actually able to see correctly. This bendy piece of calcite. Well, what can calcite do? What is calcite? Well, calcite, for the chemists out there, is made up predominantly of calcium carbonate, which is the base mineral, and calcite can do all sorts of wonderful things. It can make stalactites and stalagmites, beautiful, great big displays. It can make gorgeous crystals. Do you know what calcite always does though? Calcite always has straight edges of its crystals. Now, the crystals can be built together to make a dripping stalactite, or they can be put together, but, you know, the actual individual crystals, they always have straight edges. They never make bendy edges, not in calcite. Do you know what calcite can't do? It can't make bendy lenses, not by itself. So calcite by itself cannot produce a lens that makes the trilobite see. But could evolved DNA do this? Well, we're going to come on to answer this question and really get to the bottom of what a design is. But before we do, let's just finish dealing with Dawkins. You see, you really shouldn't be afraid to challenge an atheist or be afraid to really, bring the point about design to an atheist. Because you see, if you want to challenge somebody like Dawkins, there's a very simple question that you can ask them. Excuse me, Mr. Dawkins, how many eyes have you successfully designed? Do you know what the answer is? Absolutely none. So you see, Dawkins, if you want to complain about God's design, maybe I suggest design a better one first. Because when you can design a better eye, we'll be impressed. But until then, I would suggest not calling God an idiot. It's not going to go down very well. You see, if you want to design, whether it be an eye, whether it be the whole trilobite, whether it be a fungus, or whether it be a flower, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process. You actually need to produce it very quickly and very well indeed. So you see, if you really want to get to the bottom of this, you need to ask yourself the big question, well, what is a design in the end? Well, you can go one step further with this because you see, it's an interesting little piece of mind sort of thinking through. I mean, let's start basic. You remember that definition that we had? A design, when you have the end properties, the end result has properties that do not come from the original materials. What are we talking about? Let's start simple. What is a guitar? A guitar is a 100% musical object made out of 100% non-musical parts. I mean, think about it. It's made out of wood, which comes from trees, and it's made out of string, which originally came from entwined horsehair. And you can go up and strum a tree or strum a horse, and it's not going to make a beautiful sound. Well, the horse might make a sound, but it's not going to be beautiful. But you see, if you apply intelligence and some energy, particularly intelligence-driven energy, to that wood and that horsehair, you can actually make a musical instrument. You see, the end properties of the guitar, that it makes a lovely sound, do not come from the materials that it's made of. Wood does not inherently produce a guitar, neither does horsehair. But if someone who was not part of it, someone who existed before it, and someone who is far cleverer than it, can actually take those source materials and put them together to produce something that does work. The end properties of the object, the guitar, have the end result of the guitar has properties that do not come from the original materials. Okay, let's step it up a notch, because you see, everybody that I've ever met is able to recognize whether something is designed or not. But not everybody is able to actually define what a design is. So let's ask ourselves this: what is a car? A car is a 100% moving object made from 100% non-moving parts. I mean, it's metal out of the ground, it's rubber tires from trees, it's all sorts of stuff. Glass from sand. Individually, those things have got no properties that would be indicative of a moving vehicle. But put them together in the right place by somebody who is not part of it, somebody who existed before it, and somebody who's far cleverer than it, and you get a motor vehicle. You can do the same with a jumbo jet. It's a 100% flying object made out of 100% non-flying parts. Well, what about a computer code? Computer codes are made up of ones and zeros. But you see, the computer code, which is here in my laptop, is so strung out so that when I press my button here, it goes to the next slide. You see, in a computer code, 1 doesn't mean 1 and 0 doesn't mean 0. It's the thing which has been designed to actually string together in the right order to have some meaning. You see, the computer code is a 100% coded object made out of 100% non-coding parts. It doesn't mean anything until somebody says that it means what it says it means. I mean, let's break this down for a minute. If I was to stand up here and say to you, ... what am I saying? SOS. And you all knew what that meant. Now, could I have said SOS to you using the code, which is, of course, Morse code, in a way that meant that I couldn't say ... Well, I could do it perhaps with a whistle. Would you have still understood it? You would. What about if I did it with a flashlight? Would you have understood it? Yes, you would. Could I have used sticks and stones? ... dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot. You could have understood it. You see, the code actually is more than the things that it's made of. Stones and sticks by themselves do not make a Morse code. Neither do whistles. It actually takes somebody who existed before the code, somebody who is cleverer than the code, and somebody who's not part of the code to actually make those things say what they mean. Of course, the man who invented the code was Mr. Morse. And dot, dot, dot did not mean S until Mr. Morse said that it did. You see, a code is something different than just what it's made from, and it always comes from a source of an intelligence. It does not exist until somebody says that it does. Okay, let's go one more step. Inside you, there's a code. That code is called DNA. What's DNA made from? Sugars, phosphates, carbons come together into an acid? You see, most of those individual things you probably ate for your breakfast this morning, and it doesn't code for life. But you see, if you take those things, those individual things which have no inherent code for life, and you put them together in exactly the right way, then you produce a substance which not only is a code for life, it's a substance that can actually replicate itself. It's a substance that codes in 4 dimensions because it codes in a linear way. It can code in 2 dimensions. It's a 3-dimensional object, and the code changes over time to mean something else. It's a 4-dimensional coding object. It's insanely complex. But you see, DNA bears all the hallmarks of a design. Somebody who was not a part of it, somebody who existed before it, and somebody who is far cleverer than it actually made the individual parts of DNA do what they do not do by themselves. I wonder who this creator might be. Oh, and by the way, DNA doesn't just design for life, but I hope you all realize here that you are designed to not evolve. Because you see, evolution, well, the driving force of evolution is supposed to be mutations, mistakes in your DNA, which is selected for or against by natural selection, so that those who are unable to survive die out. But I hope you realize that you have a mechanism within your DNA which stops you from mutating. That's what it's designed for. Now, in the fallen world that we live in, of course, mistakes and mutations do happen. Most of them actually are bad. They're detrimental to you. But you see, the very fact that DNA has a system to stop itself from mutating tells you there's no way that you could have evolved. You're designed to not evolve. Do you know what you are designed to do? Reproduce after your own kind. Just like every other living thing. 10 times in Genesis chapter 1 it says that. And yes, I've said it before, I'll say it again. If God says something once, you ought to pay attention. If he says something 10 times in one relatively short chapter, he's really trying to drive the point home. 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. God says that all living things were either created after their kind or commanded to reproduce after their kind, and DNA in all living things bears the hallmark of this. It's designed to not evolve. DNA, the DNA that's inside you, the DNA that's inside every animal, every plant, every living thing, from a fungus to a dolphin, is designed and bears all the hallmarks of being so. So you do have to stop and ask yourself, well, according to the law of copyright and intellectual property, if somebody has designed something, you must give the creator their due. That's why we drive the word Ford on the front of our car, right? That's why we have Microsoft written onto our laptops. If somebody has designed something, you give them their due. So who is the creator of DNA? John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, all things were made by the Word. So this is a pretty powerful word. Not only is there a Word in the beginning, so he's eternal, the Word was with God in the beginning, equal to God, and actually was God. All things were made by the Word, and if you drop down to verse 14 of John chapter 1, hey, we did that this morning. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and his name is Jesus Christ. You see, the evidence is really there that Jesus Christ is the creator. And it's so abundantly clear to everybody, whether you're the hardest atheist or the most committed Christian. The evidence of God's design is there in the world around us so that nobody has any excuse but to believe. Don't be afraid to challenge Richard Dawkins or your friendly local atheist who wants to challenge you. You see, it's very easy to recognize a design. We all do it. Now you've got the chance and the opportunity to be able to define what a design is. If something has an object has properties that do not come from the materials that it's made of, it's clearly been designed. And that doesn't matter whether it is as simple as a boomerang, as complex as a computer code, as complex as a Boeing 747, or whether it's as insanely complex as a DNA or indeed a human body. All of it bears the hallmark that it has been designed. Don't be surprised, by the way, we're made in the image of God. God's the creator of all. Therefore, we bear that image of wanting to design and create. You realize we're the only animals that do it? And one of the most amazing pieces of design in the human body is the fact that we can hold our hands up like this and we can touch our thumb to every single finger. You know, apes can't do that. That's why apes have never painted a picture. Not like the Mona Lisa anyway. But humans can, because we are designed to actually do things that reflect the image of God, and creating things is one of those. Let me round this up to make a really poignant point. This creativity, by the way, that we reflect the attributes of the Creator in being made in the image of God, I hope you realize that God designed us in his own image, knowing full well that part of that image is creativity, knowing full well that we as humans would use that creativity to design the worst possible means of execution so that we could execute God himself. Hey, doesn't that make the grace of Christ look so great? He actually didn't just leave us in our sin. In fact, he actually created us knowing full well that we were going to sin, knowing full well we're going to use this creativity to orchestrate the worst possible way of killing him, and he still willfully made us, knowing that he would be the one who would have to come to die to save us from our sins. Isn't it a great, great God that we serve? And shouldn't we be so grateful that not only has he saved us, but he's stamped his nature into all of creation, whether it be you, me, a fungus or a flower, so that we are able to recognize abundantly and above all that Jesus Christ really is who he said he is.